Her father had called it the November window, not in any formal sense, not with any awareness that what he was naming was an oceanographic phenomenon with a mechanism in a scientific literature and a place in the regional hydrological record. He called it the November window because that was when it opened, the third week of October through mid-November, give or take a week depending on the year, when the northern quadrant of the passage came alive in a way the rest of the passage didn't and the rest of the year couldn't replicate. He had first noticed it in 1974, in his third year running the ferry route between Orcas Landing and the smaller island to the north. He had noticed that the way you notice things when you cross the same water twice a day, every operating day, for years on end, not as a discovery, but as an accumulation. The passage doing something it hadn't been doing, and then doing it again the following year, and the year after that, until the pattern was unmistakable and he had started writing it down. Nora Voss had found the first entry about it in Volume 3 of the Wooden Box when she was 31, and had just taken over the route from her father, who was stepping back from the wheel after 30 years. She had read it as a piece of local lore, the kind of observation that experienced mariners accumulated and pass along. She had not read it as data. She was 63 years old now. She had been crossing this passage twice a day for 22 years. And the Wooden Box was still in the wheelhouse where her father had left it. 52 volumes of daily observation in his careful, compressed handwriting, and she had come to understand the November window in the way you understood something you had watched every year for 2 decades. The Wooden Box had come with the wheelhouse, the same way the route had come with the license, and the ferry had come with the company, and the company had come with her father's retirement. She had never moved the box. It sat on the shelf above the chart table on the port side, slightly wedged against a bulkhead to keep it from sliding in rough weather, and she had looked at it most mornings before her first run without thinking much about what it contained. In her early years on the route, she had read the logbooks with some attention, partly from curiosity about her father's observations, partly to understand aspects of the passage he had found worth noting. He had been a man of few words in conversation, but considerable precision in writing, and the logbooks captured a version of his attention that she had not seen elsewhere. She had read the November window entries with interest. She had not transferred them to any formal record. They had seemed like one man's careful observation of a body of water he loved, and she had treated them as such. They were not filed anywhere. They were not indexed. If you wanted to find what he had written about the November window in any specific year, you had to pull the relevant volume from the box and read it. That was the form the knowledge was in. A wooden box in a wheelhouse, 52 volumes, requiring someone to know it was there. The passage itself had confirmed what her father had written. Every October, she began watching for the signs he had described. The slight greening of the surface water in the northern quadrant, the change in how the current ran over a specific underwater feature near the north shore, the gathering of murrelets and common murres in concentrations that didn't appear anywhere else in the passage at any other time of year. The deep water coming up cold and nutrient-dense, creating a brief seasonal abundance that the surface ecology responded to immediately and visibly. She had watched it for 22 years. She had never submitted a report about it. She had never contacted a marine researcher. She had never connected the November window to anything that required connecting it to anything. It was simply what the passage did in November, and she crossed the passage every day, so she saw it. The Wind Energy Project Environmental Review had been underway for 2 years when Nora first read the project documentation carefully. She had known about the project for longer than that. It was large enough to have been covered in the regional newspaper and discussed at the island's town hall meetings, and she had attended 2 of those meetings in her capacity as the ferry operator, because the project's marine construction footprint would affect her navigation route during the installation period. She had raised navigation questions at those meetings, and had received reasonable answers about the construction corridor and timing. She had not, at those meetings, connected the project sighting to the November window. She made the connection on a Wednesday evening in January, sitting at her kitchen table with the project environmental review document, all 312 pages of it, and a topographic map of the passage floor that the project had included in the appendix. She had printed the map from the project's online filing portal, the way you printed things when you needed to spread them out and look at them rather than trying to hold the picture in your head from a screen. The turbine foundation locations were marked on the map. She had been looking at the map for several minutes, trying to reconcile the grid of foundation points with her mental image of the passage's northern quadrant, when she realized what she was seeing. The turbine foundation cluster in the northern quadrant sat directly over the underwater ridge formation that her father had first described in 1974 as the apparent topographic trigger for the November window's upwelling. His 1974 entry read, "Water comes up off the north ridge in the third week of October. Must be the floor shape pushing the bottom current to surface. Same feature every year. The north ridge." She drove to the ferry terminal the following morning and pulled Volume 3 out of the box. She had not read Volume 3 in years. She lifted it from the box with particular care you learn to use with old paper after enough time. Not fragile exactly. The covers were stiff cardboard, but something that deserved not to be dropped. She read it standing at the chart table. The ferry and the slip, the first run still 40 minutes away. Her father's handwriting had not changed across the volumes. It was the same in 1974 as it was in 2001. The same compressed lettering and the same blue pen he had apparently always used. The same economy of description that conveyed the maximum information in the minimum space. Her father had characterized the North Ridge in a series of October and November entries across the mid-1970s with the observation skills of a man who crossed the same water twice a day and had nothing to measure with except attention. He described the current behavior over the ridge at different tidal stages, the way the surface water changed color downstream of the feature, the species he saw feeding over it in November, and where exactly they concentrated relative to the ridge's apparent orientation. He had not known the ridge's depth or precise dimensions. He had known its effects. Nora pulled out her own recent logbooks. She had started keeping records in her 5th year on the route, not from any particular intention, but because her father's habit had seemed like the right practice, and she had inherited it the way she had inherited everything else about the route, and confirmed what she already knew from memory. The same ridge, the same upwelling, the same bird concentrations, every November for 22 years. She called the Wind Energy Projects Community liaison number. She was told that the formal comment period had closed 6 months earlier, but that she could submit a written observation to the project record, and it would be considered in the ongoing monitoring program. She submitted a written comment at the stakeholder meeting the following week anyway. The meeting was held in the community room at the island's library, about 45 people attending. The project team was professional and well-prepared, with slide presentations covering the array design, the construction timeline, the environmental mitigation plan. Nora waited for the public comment period. She brought Volume 3 of the wooden box and 2 of her own recent logbooks. She described the November window. She described the North Ridge as her father had described it and as she had watched it. She described the bird concentrations and their relationship to the upwelling. She said, "The turbine foundation cluster in the northern quadrant is sited directly over the ridge feature that drives the seasonal event. I have 54 years of observation from this passage. My father's 30 years and my own 22, plus overlap, showing that this event occurs at this location every year. The survey data for this review was collected in June and July. The project's oceanographic consultant, a composed woman named Dr. Falk, listened carefully. She said that seasonal upwelling in Puget Sound was well characterized in the regional scientific literature. She said that the environmental review's seabird and marine mammal surveys, conducted in June and July, had found the northern quadrant to be within normal parameters for the region. She said that if a November upwelling event of ecological significance occurred in this location, it would have been documented in the state's marine monitoring data. Nora said the survey was in June and July. The November window runs from mid-October to mid-November. Dr. Falk said the project's post-installation monitoring program would include November sampling. Nora said by then the turbine foundations will be installed. Dr. Falk said she understood the concern. She said the construction schedule was designed around the biological windows identified in the state's monitoring data, which did not include a November upwelling event in this location. The meeting ended. Nora drove the volumes back to the terminal and put them in the box. She had expected the outcome. She had not expected to feel, on the drive back to the terminal, as certain as she was, not of winning the argument, but the thing itself, The November window was as real as anything she had ever observed in 22 years on this water. Her father had watched it for 30 years before her. The survey had happened in the wrong month. She also began to doubt herself, in the specific way that doubt arrived when you had been certain and then questioned and had not been able to sustain the certainty through the questioning. Maybe the June and July surveys had captured something she wasn't reading correctly. Maybe the ridge feature she had been watching was not the ecological driver of the November event. Maybe she had built a pattern out of what was actually a collection of coincidences accumulated over decades. She had done this before, built significance out of a thing that turned out to be unremarkable. Years ago, she had been convinced that a persistent current anomaly in the southern channel indicated a change in the passage floor, and had mentioned it at a harbor meeting, and had been quietly informed that the anomaly was a seasonal artifact of the ferry terminal's new dock design, and had been noted and dismissed 2 years earlier. She had felt foolish for that. She was aware she might feel foolish again. She watched the November window that year more carefully than she had in years, recording the surface water color change, the current behavior, the bird concentrations, the dates and tide stages, comparing them in real time against her father's records from the same period. The match was exact. The event occurred within 4 days of the same date range, as in every year going back to 1974. The bird concentrations were in the same locations relative to the ridge. She was not wrong about the thing. She was only wrong about having the right form for it. The turbine foundation installation proceeded the following summer. She watched it from the ferry on her daily runs. The work vessels, the anchor-setting equipment, the sections of foundation structure lower to floor at the northern quadrant locations. She noted each foundation installation in her logbook: date, location, weather, tidal stage. She did not know why she was doing this with more precision than usual, except that it seemed like the kind of information that might matter. The following October, Nora began watching for the November window. The surface water color change appeared in the northern quadrant in the 3rd week of October, on schedule. But the murre concentrations, the most reliable and visible indicator of the upwelling's ecological effect, were not in their usual positions over the ridge. They were present in the northern quadrant, but distributed differently, scattered across a broader area. The tight feeding aggregations that her father had described in his 1970s entries, and that she had watched every year absent from their usual coordinates. She recorded this carefully. She noted the specific locations where birds were absent that were usually dense, and where they were present in lower numbers across the broader area. She took photographs from the ferry's upper deck. She called the Marine Research Station at the university's Puget Sound program and asked if anyone was studying late-season seabird foraging in the passage. The researcher who called her back was a graduate student named Dr. O'Kello, who had been studying murrelet feeding ecology in Puget Sound for 3 years and had noticed, in his monitoring data, an unusual shift in the November foraging distribution of murres and murrelets in the northern passage area in the first post-installation season. He came out on the ferry in November twice, standing on the upper deck with binoculars and a GPS device, recording bird positions in relation to the current surface patterns he could observe from the vessel. After the second transit, he came to the wheelhouse. He said, "The concentrations have moved. They used to be tighter, centered over the ridge. Now they're dispersed, and there's a secondary concentration about a quarter mile east-northeast of where you'd expect the main aggregation." Nora said, "That's consistent with what I've been seeing this year." Dr. O'Kello said, "The secondary concentration is where the upwelling surface expression is occurring now. The primary zone has shifted. The bird distribution is tracking it." He asked how long she had been observing the primary zone's location. She showed him the wooden box. Dr. O'Kello spent a weekend at the ferry terminal with the volumes, reading through her father's November entries from 1974 to 2001, and then her own entries from 2002 to the installation year. He was building a timeline of where the upwelling surface expression had been located, year by year, from behavioral evidence in the logbooks, before and after the turbine installation. He came back to her with a question she hadn't anticipated. He said, "Has the upwelling always occurred in exactly the same location, or has it shifted in previous years?" She thought about it carefully. She had not been tracking the precise location with GPS, only describing it in relation to visible landmarks and the ridge's general position. She went back through the entries, her father's and her own, and found that the location description was consistent year after year. The same landmarks, the same orientation. Not identical in every detail, but within a consistent range. Dr. Okello said, "That's unusual. Most upwelling events have a natural spatial variability. A highly consistent location usually means the trigger in topography is very specific, a small, precise feature that locks the upwelling in place." He said, "If the turbine anchor installation disturbed that feature, even partially, it could shift the upwelling's surface expression to a secondary location where the ridge's influence is less concentrated. That would explain the dispersed bird distribution." He ran acoustic current profiling on the passage in the following January, focusing on the North Ridge area. The results showed a change in the current's interaction with the ridge compared to pre-installation surveys. The foundation installation had partially covered a section of the ridge's crest, altering the bottom topography in a way that shifted the upwelling's primary expression. Dr. Okello's paper, submitted to a peer-reviewed marine ecology journal, documented the passage's November upwelling event, its relationship to North Ridge topography, the shift in the upwelling's surface expression following the turbine foundation installation, and the corresponding change in the seabird feeding distribution. The historical documentation section cited 52 volumes of her father's logbooks and 22 years of her own records as the only available baseline for the upwelling's pre-installation location and ecological significance. He showed her the draft before submission and asked if she had anything to add or correct. She read it carefully, the way she had learned to read regulatory and technical documents, for what they said and for what they didn't say. She found it accurate in its description of the November window, accurate in its description of the upwelling shift, accurate in its citation of her father's records and her own. She noticed, reading the historical documentation section, that the paper described the logbooks as if they were an obvious thing to have, as if keeping 54 years of daily behavioral observations on a commercial ferry route was a natural and expected practice. She supposed that to someone writing a marine ecology paper, it might seem that way. She knew that it had simply been two people in sequence paying attention to the same piece of water and writing down what they saw for reasons that had nothing to do with marine ecology. She asked how the paper described the logbooks. He showed her the sentence. The primary historical data source for this study consists of daily behavioral observation logs maintained by commercial ferry operators on the Orcas North Island route from 1971 to the present, representing a continuous 54-year observational record of the passage's ecological behavior. She read the sentence twice. Her father had kept those volumes to pay attention. She had kept hers for the same reason, and because he had kept his, and because the passage deserved the kind of attention that accumulation made possible. They had not kept them to become a data source in a marine ecology paper. The paper had found them because the paper needed what they held. The wooden box was still in the wheelhouse. She had not moved it in 22 years. She thought she probably never would. The passage ran outside, doing what it had always done, carrying the tide in and carrying it back out, the current bending around the North Ridge the way it had bent for longer than anyone had been watching it, and the November window opening the way it opened every year, in a slightly different place now, adapting to the change the way water adapted to every change, finding the next best version of what had been. The ferry was on the afternoon run, the water dark and fast in the way it was fast when the tide was doing what it was supposed to do. The wooden box was in the wheelhouse where it had always been. The next person who ran this route, if there was a next person, if the route survived, would find it there and could do whatever they chose with what it held. She crossed the passage the way she always crossed it. She was paying attention.